Thank you, DB. As the representative of Human Synergistics, I am not going to talk about Human Synergistics. This is one of the great things about what this material does. The clients do the talking. In fact, very interesting piece of feedback about 18 months ago where a new client started to work with us, a fairly large global corporation, the Australian business in particular. And the head of human resources said to DB, you know, your business is a bit like a cult. He said, the really interesting thing is when you're on the outside looking in, it looks like a cult. But when you're inside doing it, you're wondering why the hell he didn't start doing this years ago. Very interesting feedback. I want to, before I start, acknowledge some of the past speakers that are here, if I may. You've heard Uncle Bob Barber referred to. So Bob, wherever you are amongst the bright lights out there, thank you. Jen White, who spoke at our conference last year, Rob Phipps from Yum Foods, who's been involved with the conferences over the years, Sam Kennard from Kennard Self-Storage, who spoke at our very first conference and in fact received our very first Transformation Award, Commander Ros Asfalk from Royal Australian Navy, who spoke here a couple of years ago, Alan McGilvray, who spoke as CEO of Bayer several years back, and Peter Fuder, I believe, was somewhere out there, somebody told me, who worked with the likes of Alan McGilvray and wrote the book Leadership Transformed. So thank you and welcome. And if I haven't seen you, I haven't mentioned you. So if you are here and not mentioned, thanks very much. Look, I feel before I get too far into what I want to cover, which I'll need to cover very quickly, is I feel compelled to explain the tie. Right? It's a very good illustration of culture, because culture is about behavioural norms. And often those norms, to be slightly technical, are represented by artefacts of those norms. But there are certain, so a norm is an expected way of behaving. So wind the clock back several years, men were expected to wear a tie when they went into a professional or a formal situation. So it's a very good illustration of how norms do in fact change. So you witnessed a changing norm here today. None of the presenters wore a tie. So I've spent 42 years working against the prevailing norms and organisations to create change, so I thought, fuck it, I'm going to wear a tie. And those amongst my staff that have been running a book on how far into the presentation Shaun would swear, you just got it. Okay, my presentation. This is my one thing. Another part of my role up here is to sort of pull the links together for the various speakers. So let me do that before I quickly flip through these slides. One of the very important elements that came out in every presentation is the notion of complexity. This is a bit of a favourite of mine because we have complexity and simplicity, but in fact we have complexity and simplification. Those of you like me who work in the world of organisational change, organisational development, human resources, training and development, we work in an extremely complex world. The risk is that we try to make that world simple. You cannot. We work in an extremely complex world. So some examples of this. Mary Lemonis talked about managing paradoxes and the Ulrich model around the paradox navigator. Great phrase. So we must deal with paradoxes. Sam talked about it's not just reading Dan Pink's book on Drive and saying everybody should have autonomy. It's significantly more complex than that. And he used the expression, understanding the context for excellence. Rob, of the Murray variety, talked about how we need to simplify the work. So his job, our job, is to deal with the complexity. So Bob Barber at Lion's job was to deal with that complexity. But other people, including Bob, had the job to make that simple for people to get it and understand it. And Rob of the Cook variety talked about the narrative that links culture and climate, that part of this complexity is we need to understand the precision. We need to be precise about what we are talking about. And for us, of course, we need to be precise about what we're measuring. So for those of you in the HR industry in its broadest context, embrace that complexity, but find ways to simplify it for your target market. At this point, I'll give you one of my favourite quotes, and I prefer to read quotes to make sure I get them accurate. It's from H.L. Mencken, who's an American journalist. Said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Keep that in mind. Leadership. So some of the what I thought were good links. So Sam talked about, before working on the culture, I had to work on myself. Mary talked about an interesting phrase, the more senior you are, the less you get the truth. So it's about how I impact the culture and the relationship. So last year's conference was called for a very good purpose, leadership and culture, it's a two-way street. Grant talked about if we don't portray the behaviours we want, we won't get them through the rest of the organisation. And Rob, again, of the Murray variety, a very simple phrase, leaders' behaviour makes culture. So taking some very complex concepts and making it simple for people. Yeah, I get that. Leaders' behaviour makes culture, right? But sitting behind that is an awful lot of information, research and knowledge. The other thing is around knowledge. I'll share with you one of my other favourite quotes at the moment. And this is from a British journalist, Miles Kington. Knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. Okay? So again, in the HR complex industry that we work in, it's not just about data, it's not just about knowledge, it's the wisdom associated with that knowledge. So the wisdom expressed in that very simplified expression, leaders' behaviours drives culture. Okay? So coming back to the links, the other key link that everybody talked about was purpose. So to quote some of them, Sam said, connect people to a purpose. Help them find their why. Mary talked about values. It's not just posters on the wall. It's got to be a sense of purpose around that behaviour. Grant talked about culture as part of strategy. It's not separate to strategy. That's the purpose deal. And I'll bring in Uncle Greg from the very beginning when he said, you can never have knowledge without purpose. That was a good phrase. And the last one around collaboration, I'll start with Uncle Greg. He said, we're all one mob. Great phrase. Mary talked about how we are more similar than we are different. And specifically, Grant talked about collaboration, and you heard some of the folks talking about collaboration on the video there. So the message that I would like to get across is a very brief one. And that is that there's plenty of evidence. And you've seen lots of that evidence today around building a constructive culture enhances performance. So here's some simple illustrations for you. Transportation industry. So I don't need to read those to you, apart from the fact I can't see this damn thing without my glasses on. So you can see some very, very significant improvements in that industry. In a water utility, leakages and breakages are a pretty big thing for them. And I was reading some material yesterday on this organisation. One of the ones that's not there, and I think it should be, is that they, for the first time, if you're interested in industrial safety, went through a 12-month period with no LTIs. Not a cracker. It's a fairly sizable organisation. And FMCG, so increase in shareholder value, increase in share price, increase in profit returns, increase in customer satisfaction, etc. Another example is in healthcare, substantial increase in profitability for that organisation, operates on the West Coast, and increases in all sorts of other good measures associated with that. So, I mean, if somebody sits to me and sits down with me and says, look, I don't really believe there's a link between culture and performance, my response nowadays is, where the hell have you been for the last 10 years, right? Because it's there, it's done and dusted. So significantly, we can create another pattern, and that is that we see evidence that the organisation culture either hinders or helps the performance. So I use this slide to evidence that. It's another very good, so the client is out there, you remain nameless in this instance, but it's a very good illustration of something that we really haven't talked about, which is equally important as part of this complexity, is the notion of subcultures. So we talk about the organisation's culture, but in fact, I mean, if there's 57 radio stations, for instance, or 58, there's a possibility there could be 58 different subcultures. There may or may not be, hopefully there aren't. But here's an illustration of subcultures and how one helps and one hinders. So this is simply a client taking its culture survey data and looking at the state. So this is state 1 versus state 2. So you can see this, the ocean of blue, to quote the SCA person on the video, versus a sort of tides going out kind of profile. And so for want of a benchmark, this is state number 1. So above the line are all positive outcomes. okay, associated with profitability, staff turnover, churn, etc., etc. So don't read that as a high churn, read it as a very positive against budget measure. But here's the bottom one. And in every single instance, so the last is the overall scorecard, in every single incidence, the performance is significantly below state one. So on the one hand, culture helps, on the other hand, culture hinders. So why is culture so influential? Just to wrap things up for you, I'm going to take two views. One, if you like, is a slightly technical, the other is an everyday. So we're all familiar with the notion of systems, the notion that the organisation functions as a system, some sort of social system. And each social system must achieve three goals. Every physical system, for that matter, must achieve three goals: integration, adaptation, and achievement of whatever its stated goal. So for an organisation, integration is about getting the subunits and the teams and the people and the cross-functional groups, etc., working together. So an excellent illustration of integration. I went to the fantastic show My Fair Lady a few nights ago on Saturday night. If you haven't been to it, it's very dated. You've got to put up with the song called If Only a Woman Would Think Like a Man, right? But within the context when it was written, it's fabulous music, and the singers are magnificent. And there are a couple of icons of the Australian stage, and Reg Livermore, and I can't remember his first name, Llewellyn Jones. But a good illustration of integration. I mean, if the orchestra in the pit starts playing song number 3 and the singers start singing song number 4, we've got a bit of a problem. So that needs to be integrated. And so in organisational speak, it's how well does the left hand know what the right hand is doing, right? And adaptation, of course, we read daily about digital disruption and all this kind of stuff. So it's how are we adapting and responding. And then there's the achievement of profitability, survival, growth, innovation, whatever it might be. And the bottom line, quite literally, is that integration is dependent upon culture, adaptation is dependent upon culture, and so therefore, by definition, the achievement of the stated goal becomes dependent upon culture. So how does that work in our everyday life, right? One of the things we know, the research by, again, I'll call him his formal title, Dr. Robert Cook, and also Dr. Janet Zurmel. Janet, would you like to stand up, say hi to everybody? Fantastic researcher. Because it's the research that turns the knowledge into wisdom, right? You think about it, we know that tomato is a fruit, but somehow we've got to figure out it doesn't go quite so well with oranges and pears and apples, right? So you find that out by experimenting and running research around it. You had one with a tomato and did you like it? No. Oh, okay. So this is where the research sits. So we know that in constructive cultures, constructive organisations, individuals will do what you want them to do in terms of putting that extra effort in, going that extra mile, focusing on what needs to be focused. Very important element. So they'll focus on doing the job well. So therefore you get all sorts of outcomes like if you're focusing on doing the safety aspects of your job well, you'll have no lost time injuries over the 12-month period. If you're focusing on the quality of product or service, then you'll have high quality of service. If you're focusing on the profitability, you're not going to give away the store, all this kind of stuff. At the same time, because these are not separate to, how the groups function. So both how we function in teams and how we function between teams. So if you just think about your organisation, the world has spent billions and billions of dollars on team building and team development. So we put a lot of effort into making our teams work very well. But strangely enough, we haven't spent much on making the teams work well across each other. And we see this when we look at teams that get very positive feedback from within the team, from themselves. But when we ask other teams, how do you find that team to work with? Oh, bloody hell, right? So it's because it creates the ability for people to work together. So put very simply, the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. Right? And at the organisational level, I chose this phrase, it's one of the items in the survey for self-actualising, if you like the detail, is that the organisation emphasises quality over quantity. So it's about doing well as opposed to getting lots of, whatever it might be, right? And so the quality over quantity makes a number of very interesting behaviours happen. If I'm working on a water line, for instance, and I see a potential leak, and I look at my watch and I go, oh God, that meeting starts in 2 minutes, It's now, do I emphasise quantity over quality? Do I fix that leak, or do I go to the meeting because I know I'll get reamed out by my supervisor if I'm late for the meeting? Right? That's what we mean by quality over quality. The quality is we don't want a leak, so I should fix the leak. Now the culture kicks in as to what happens when I walk in 10 minutes late to that meeting. Do I get told off for being late for the meeting, etc.? Right? And so we look at the behaviour and we reinforce the behaviour, but often the behaviour is not actually indicative of what is constructive. Okay? So very simply, that's why culture is so overwhelming. I think one of the speakers, I didn't write it down, so I don't know who said it, but one of the speakers says culture is everything. Must have been probably one of the two from SCA because it's popped into my head. And that's why it is everything. What you be careful of is that culture gets the blame for everything. To that extent, it's not necessarily everything. But what happens is the way in which individuals operate, the way in which we work in groups, and the way in which we collectivise that group effort to create some sort of output is significantly determined by the culture. So Rob Cook, variety, Dr. Rob, talked about climate being the present and culture being the future. That's where we land. So we're looking at present indicators of performance, and we're looking at a very significant lead indicator of future performance for the organisation. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers. It's a big give for them to do this. They have to travel to Melbourne last week. They were busy as hell. And thank you for coming. It's a big commitment from you, and it's a great honour for us to think that you'll give up 3 hours of your time to come and listen to this stuff. So thank you very much.